Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Thinking Theologically podcast, the show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Dodgen, joined as always by the resident master theologian in training, Spencer Shaw. And we've spent a couple episodes looking at various textual variants and looking at actually applying the textual criticism that we've been discussing. And we looked at just singular words or verses all the way up to giant sections when it comes to like the ending of Mark in the last couple of episodes. So encourage you to check those out if you haven't already. Today we shift in a little bit of a different direction, though it goes alongside what we've recently talked about. We want to look at what Bible translation you should use. I know that there are people who are very passionate about this particular subject that will talk to you forever about this is the one you should use and here's why. And so we wanted to tackle that particular subject today when it comes to Bible translations. Spencer, where do you want to start with this potentially big, maybe this is our big controversial subject, who knows? Where do you want to start?
I think you're onto something that we've been talking a lot about questions of how we got the Bible, how was the Bible written, how do we know what it originally said? We talked about missing verses and textual variants and all kinds of things like that. But this is probably in all of that discussion, I think the most important piece to talk about. And the reason that I say that is because it means the most to people. So when you're trying to learn about God or Jesus, when you want to know how to live, how you shouldn't live, when you're coming to church and hearing a sermon, when you're trying to encounter God through scripture, you're doing so in an English translation because the Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek, a little bit of Aramaic, some Latin loan words are found in there. And for pretty much all of us, most of us don't read Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic or Latin loan words or anything like that. So we need a Bible in English. We need a Bible in our own language. And so I think this discussion is maybe the most important because it means something for our Bible study. And as you said, there's a lot of people that have what is to them very important opinions and strong opinions on what translation is the best, which one you should use, even some that you should not use. And we're going to try to solve all of that in this one episode. But before we kind of jump into it, to set the stage, there are two quotes and one comment that I want to make that I think help us to set the stage. The first is this: we live in a society where the average person changes their place of residence every 5 or 6 years, buys a different car about every 4 years, and changes jobs about 5 times during their lifetime, and yet we are reluctant to change our Bible translation. I think this helps set the stage just to illustrate why I think it is important for us to talk about Bible translations and to ask questions about what translation should I use, what translation should I not use, what is the best, and how even when we think about progress, how are translations continuing to progress and to change? Because I know in my lifetime, I have been preaching full time for 7, 8 years now, preached here and there, when I was in college. And so we go back to like college all the way through to now. I've used 3 different translations. So well, 4. So I've changed my translations 3-ish times. Now I actually use 2 different ones. I'll talk about what I use towards the end. But I've changed the one that I've preached from. I've preached from 4 different ones. And so I've thought about changing again. And so I'm always, as a preacher, concerned about what translation am I using and some reasons why I think that needs to be a concern for us. And I'll mention that as we move on. But I think it's something important for us to think about. The second quotation is translation work is an endless process. As languages change, as additional copies of ancient manuscripts continue to turn up, and as scholars come to know and understand the ancient language better. And so we should want translations to change and to be updated because our language updates. And so English words that meant something 100 years ago might mean something different today. So we want the English to be updated. We continue to discover new manuscripts that might make slight changes to the way that a particular verse reads. Not anything major, but slight changes. And so we should want translations to make the effort to update in that regard. And then scholars learn more about the ancient world that help them to better understand the language that's used. And so we should want that to be a part of the updating process. And so we should want to find updated, newer, better translations as time goes on. The one comment that I wanted to make to kind of set the stage is to say that all translation is interpretation. Because the point of translation is to get across what the author meant when they wrote those words. So Matthew writes something, he means something by it, and a translation is to try to bring Matthew's meaning across to somebody in a different language. So for us, into the English language. And so in order to do that, you have to interpret in some way what Matthew is trying to get across so that you can accurately translate that. And that's important because, as we'll see, every translation has its issues, and every translation committee has biases based upon their theology because they're doing interpretation as they're going through the process of translating. And so, no translation is perfect. No translation is without issues. No translation is without biases because all translation is interpretation.
Yeah, so none perfect. However, the thing that makes the your Bible translation choice really difficult is nostalgia is a big thing. So a lot of the people that I've talked to, uh, older professors or things, those that grew up with like, in the one teacher I'm thinking of is New King James, and so when we would read a verse that he was requesting us read in class, or we were giving some answer, it he would he had it all memorized, but he had it all memorized in that one translation. And so for him, he could get caught up on, I don't like the wording of that. Let's say it this way instead. And it's not that he thought it was a more faithful translation as much as he did. This is what I grew up with. This is what I've always had. Uh, we change all these other things like that quote you said, but we don't necessarily want to change all those other things. And so I wonder if there isn't some amount of like, I can control this and I can just keep this Bible forever, which is true. But there is no perfect translation. And so what we'll deal with today of looking at what you use and how all that plays into your study is important for that. I think you've actually been preaching full time longer than me by a year or so. I've been in ministry for 12 years and preaching on and off throughout, but like full time preaching. But I've switched Bible translations from teen years through 3 times, and then right now, like you said, there are multiples that I kind of think about. Though one of a couple of them are weird, but maybe we'll discuss that later. But many translations, all of them, interpretations. How do they go about this interpretation process? What is the science of the translation like method? What do they have to figure out as they're putting these things together? What's some of the process here of getting a translation together?
To understand and to be able to evaluate any translation. So you walk into Barnes and Noble, they have a Bible section. You're trying to evaluate one translation over another translation, or you're on Amazon or whatever. To be able to do that, you have to understand that science of translation. Like, what do scholars do? What do they look for? What is the process to get these translations? And what are good ways to do that, bad ways to do that, or just multiple good ways. I mean, there's not always a good or bad way. Sometimes there's just multiple ways to do it. And there's three aspects that I want to mention when we think about the science of translation. The first is to think about words. So there's words that are written by a biblical author in Hebrew, in Greek, in Aramaic, and we are trying to translate those words into another language, in the case for most of us, into English. And English also has words. And there's an inherent problem in the meaning and usage of words when you try to translate a word from one language to another language. And one aspect of that is just to realize that words can and most do have multiple meanings. There are very few words that only ever mean one specific thing. Most words have multiple meanings, and a context determines what the word means. And so that goes back to all translation is interpretation. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they use a word. What do they mean when they use this word? Because it can have multiple meanings. And the difficult thing is that different authors use the same word to mean different things. And so Matthew might use a word and mean something different by that word than Luke means when he uses that word. But even within one author, sometimes they use the same word to mean different things in
Hmm.
different contexts. So you can't just assume, well, Paul uses this word in chapter 1 and means this. It doesn't mean he necessarily means the same thing in chapter 10 when he uses it, though there might be good reason to believe that. But that's even true in different contexts and letters. So you're comparing Galatians to Ephesians, and you look at the overlap of language because Paul, one author tends to use the same language and images and words, but they can use those sometimes within a trajectory of different ways that that word can be thought of, and
Hmm.
they might it can kind of swim in a general direction but mean some slightly different things in some different contexts even within the same author. So that becomes the difficult thing in translation, is that you're trying to interpret how these words with multiple meanings are being used, and how do we get that across into an English word that also has multiple meanings, right? So you have a Greek word that can mean multiple things. You have to figure out what it means, and then you have to figure out what English word that also has multiple meanings best gets that idea across. And so not all Greek words have an English equivalent. It's not always a one to one. So in Greek, you can have in when verbs are used, a subject is kind of built in. So you can just have one word that's a verb. Let's say it's the verb for run. What's built into that is a subject. So you can translate that one word as he ran, or she ran, or they ran, or they are running, or it will run. Well, in English, we have to do multiple words. And so it's not always a one for one. Sometimes there's one Greek word and we have to translate it as two English words or three English words or whatever the case may be. And so sometimes words have to be supplied to make it make sense. So Paul uses verbless statements sometimes. There's examples where Paul has like a whole paragraph that's one sentence with like no verbs or something funky like that. And it's
Hmm.
hard for us to understand how you can do that. But sometimes you can do that. And so in English, we have to kind of supply, or you have one clause with a verb and you have the next clause that doesn't have a verb, or maybe it doesn't have a subject, because you're supposed to take the verb or the subject from the first clause and put it into the second clause. And so when you're translating, you have to figure that out, and then you have to add in English additional words so that it makes sense. There are idioms, so phrases, figures of speech in Hebrew or in Greek that we just don't have in English. And so
Hmm.
you have to try to figure out, how do you get the idea of this phrase across when it doesn't make sense in English. You have issues of transliteration. So baptism is an example of that. In Greek, it's baptizo or one of those forms, and it gets transliterated. It means to immerse, but it doesn't get translated as immersion. It gets transliterated, which means the Greek letters are just
Mhm.
given English letters and a new word is created, which is where we get baptism. You have the issue of connotation versus denotation. So a word can have a dictionary definition, but it can be used and mean something that sometimes is the complete opposite of what a dictionary means. And so that's also the problem of, I just want to caution people, you're reading your English Bible, there's a word that Matthew uses, and maybe you go and look it up. Well, what Greek word did they use? And you look at the dictionary definition and you're like, well, the dictionary gives me this definition. That doesn't mean that that's how Matthew is using it. That might be a starting point to begin to figure out, but again, you have to look at the context of Matthew could be using it in the opposite way.
Mhm.
The context is what is going to determine that, which goes back to all translation is interpretation. You have the issue of the fact that sometimes we have some made up words. So Paul's really good at making up his own words. And so if you think about kind of what I'm talking about of, well, you have to figure out what's the dictionary definition of this word. And you have to figure out how was it used? What's its connotation in the ancient world? What are the different meanings that it could have? What is the context in which the author is using it? Maybe how has the author used it in other places, right? You're trying to figure all that out in order to have an adequate translation. And then Paul makes up a word where you don't get any of that. You don't have a dictionary definition. You don't have a connotation. You don't have, he hasn't used this word anywhere else. He made it up when he's writing this letter. It now becomes very difficult to figure out, well, what did Paul mean? We can kind of be like, well, he pieced together these words and we know what these words mean and how they're used. And so maybe that can kind of get us moving in the right direction of what Paul might have meant when he made up this word. But that becomes very difficult to figure out what Paul might have meant or not meant when he does that. And then if you have even the issue of that the Greek word order is different than the English word order. So when you translate, a lot of the times you're having to change the word order from the original Greek or the original Hebrew into English, again, for it to make sense. And I say all that to when you think about translation just on the word level, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. You've got words in both languages that mean multiple things. You have to try to figure out what the context means. You have made up words, you have transliterated words that we use in English that don't always bring across what the original word meant. You have to change word order. You have to add subject and verb sometime because they're not there in the original. There's just all of these things that you have to do. And it's a difficult process.
Mhm.
And so we have to understand that as this process is going, there's going to be need for adjustments to be made so that the English translation makes sense to the person who is reading it. And so there's adjustments that will be needed that are required by the grammar of the target audience. You have to change word order. You have to supply a subject and a verb so that you have a sentence that makes sense in English. You have to make some adjustments to make sure that the correct meaning comes through. And we'll talk about this more, but the purpose of translation is to get the meaning across. And so sometimes you have to make adjustments that deviate a little bit from the original so that the meaning comes through, so that there is clarity in what the author was meaning, and so that there's some kind of naturalness. So just imagine your preacher gets up there to preach. He's reading from a Bible translation, and it's very, very difficult, right, for him to read. And he's tripping over words, and you're trying to figure out, it's very unnatural. Well, that doesn't help any of us in understanding the meaning. And so translators have to make these kind of adjustments. The other thing regarding words that I want to mention is I want to think of the importance, and this is something that's become more and more important to me, is gender accuracy, which is the question of who's excluded and who is included in a given passage. So, Paul uses the Greek word adelphos is the singular, adelphoi is the plural, which means its dictionary definition is brothers. And so maybe he begins a letter and he says, brothers, so on, do this, don't do that. Greetings to you, grace and peace to my fellow brothers, something like that. Well, when the word adelphoi is used, sometimes it can mean brothers, as in males that I am related to,
Hmm.
right? As opposed to sisters, females that I'm related to. But when Paul uses this word for all the Christians in Corinth or in Rome, he's not talking about males. He's talking about everybody, male and female, who is in the church in Rome. And so a more gender inclusive and more accurate translation might be brothers and sisters, because that's in effect what Paul means when he uses this word brothers. And so that's what I mean by it's the question of who is included and who is excluded. Is brothers being used to include males and to exclude females, or is it used to include both? And generally, when Paul uses it to speak of to the entire church, it's inclusive of both males and females. And so it might be better to translate that as brothers and sisters. And so it's not this question is not a question about trying to be neutral or specific, but about accurately presenting Paul's ideas.
Hmm.
And I've even had people that they've been using a translation that doesn't have gender accuracy or gender inclusion. And so when Paul says brothers, all it says is brothers. And I've had females in churches ask me if certain things that Paul says applies to them because he's using masculine language.
Mm.
And I would kind of argue of, well, the translation may be more accurate in terms of directly translating the Greek word, but it's not accurate in giving across the idea that Paul is trying to present, because he's trying to present an idea that's not just for men, but that is for both men and women, for all believers. And so that's something else that when you just think about how we're translating these words, of asking the question of inclusion and exclusion in the categories of terms that are being used. The second thing that we have to think about in the science, so first is words. Second is the text base. We talked about this in the last couple episodes ago when we talked about textual criticism. So go back and watch that episode if you haven't. You want a text base that is the most accurate. So what is the most accurate Greek text that we have? You want a Bible that uses the most accurate version, which is why most of the major modern versions update every 5 to 7 years, generally, maybe 10 years. They'll do an update because the Greek text has changed. Our knowledge of the ancient world has changed. And so they want to tweak some things here and some things there to make the English version more understandable and more accurate. And secondly, you want a text base that's not only accurate and updated, but also eclectic. And that's what we talked about in our textual criticism. You don't want a translation that uses a majority text. You want a translation that uses an eclectic Greek text. The third thing in thinking about words, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, is thinking about translation approaches. And there's three primary translation approaches, ways that scholars go about making their translation. The first type of translation is what is called a formal equivalent. A formal equivalent translation seeks to modify the Hebrew and Greek forms until the text is comprehensible. And here's what I mean by that. A formal equivalent version is going to try and stay as close to the Hebrew or Greek original as it possibly can, making slight changes and additions so that the text is comprehensible, so that people can comprehend it, but staying as close to the original as possible. Now, what this does is it gives you translations that are a little bit more wooden and bumpy and a little less natural because they're staying true to the original language, which functions very, very differently than English, and making slight changes so that we can comprehend it. But these aren't going to be the easiest to read translations. They're going to be more accurate in terms of staying close to the text and to the words, but they're going to be a little bit harder to read. On the other end, you have functional equivalent, which seek to modify the form until the text is natural. These are much more concerned with readability. How easy is it to read and to understand? And these are much more focused on the meaning of phrases and sentences. So you could think about it like this: a formal equivalent is going to be a little bit more concerned with the meaning of words. And so it's going to be tied a little bit closer to the original. It's going to be harder to read. A functional equivalent is going to care more about the meaning of phrases as a whole, not the individual words, but of phrases, the meaning of sentences as a whole. And so it's going to be focused a little bit more on readability, on ability for the text to be understood. And so it's going to be a lot more easier to read, but it's going to tie a little less closely to the words in the original Hebrew and Greek. And then there are mediating versions, which you could define as modifying forms until they're clear. This is somewhere in the middle that they care about words, they also care about phrases. They want to stay as close as they can to the original, but they also want it to be a little bit easier to read, a little bit clearer. And so those are three ways, and you can kind of think it as a spectrum. You have formal over here. We want to stay as close to the original as we can, going to be a little bit harder to read. You have functional on the other side, which cares more about the meaning of phrases and sentences. We want it very easy to read. So it's going to stay a little bit less close to the original. And then you have mediating translations, which kind of sit somewhere in the middle, which honestly, most modern translations sit somewhere in the middle. They try to balance those two, the meaning of words, the meaning of phrases and sentences. They want it to be clear and at least somewhat easier to read and to understand and for the meaning to be across. So most sit in the middle, but maybe a little bit more towards the formal. Other versions a little bit more towards the functional. And the last thing that I'll say is just the importance of translation committees. So I've said this in a previous episode. You can read your preface of your Bible, and it will tell you what Greek text they used. It will tell you what their translation approach was. What were they trying to achieve? Are they more on the functional side? Are they more on the formal side? Where kind of in the middle do they fall? And it will tell you the committee that it was translated by and even who was on the committee. Committees are important because you don't want one guy sitting doing all of it. You want a committee, a group of people that can discuss and debate amongst themselves how they're going to translate, particularly hard to translate portions of scripture. Now, Bible translations translated by one person can be helpful. So, like, I think N.T. Wright has a translation,
Mm-hmm.
and I like the way that N.T. Wright thinks about things. And so sometimes I'll look at his just to kind of get how's N.T. Wright thinking through this. But I wouldn't want that to be my primary translation. That's just what one guy thinks. But you want a group of scholars, very well educated, that can kind of debate and have these conversations among themselves as to the meaning of texts.
Yeah, when I think about the singular translations, I think the message, and that was popular when I was in middle school, high school. I think it had come out as Eugene Peterson. I think it was just him who did that. Hugo McCord and his translation of the New Testament. That's a Church of Christ associated one. So there are a few of those. They're not study Bibles, but there is, with translations being interpretation, there might be some like study Bible-ish adjacent kind of stuff. Like you said, I like how N.T. Wright thinks. Okay, well, that is going to be present in some of his translation. That's true. So you want to have these committee different things. The only thing I want to say at the end of all this, because there are a lot more words that we could throw in that are transliterations or weird sentence structures that are translated different ways. Um, the this is a bad translation versus this is a good translation, because I remember hearing like, oh well, that's a bad one. Well, it's not actually. It's doing exactly what it wants to do. Now, you may not like what it's trying to do, but it did a very good job of its translation philosophy and fulfilling those things. Again, it may not be what you want as a student, and that's okay. But these translations all have goals in mind and work to reach those goals. So if you've ever picked a couple Bibles up that are, you picked up an NIV, you picked up an ESV and went, wow, one of these really missed. No, they weren't trying to do the same thing. And we'll talk more specifically later, but they both achieved their goals well of what they're trying to do. They just had different goals in mind with those translations.
Another thing that I'll say real quick
Yeah.
on thinking about committees is another reason to read the preface of your Bible is understanding the theological starting point of the committee. So
Mm-hmm.
some committees are conservative committees, some committees are liberal committees, some committees kind of sit somewhere in the middle theologically. And that's important because it's going to let you know where they're coming from when they're interpreting in order to translate, right? So you think about some of the big differences between conservative theology and liberal theology. So something like women's roles, for example. The passages that talk about women, there's more than one way to translate those passages. The Greek allows it to be translated multiple ways. The way that you choose is going to be influenced by your theology and how you interpret them. So a conservative committee is going to consistently translate those in a way that supports a conservative theology. A liberal committee is going to translate those in a way that's going to better support a liberal theology because that's where they're coming from. And I want to say that to Jack's point, one of those is not wrong and one of those right. They're both correct ways to translate. And which is kind of the difficult thing of we as interpreters and as Christians, as we're forming our theology, kind of have to make decisions about what those passages mean. Should it be translated more this way? Should it be translated more that way? That's interpretation. It's why multiple translations are important, which is kind of where we're going to
Mm-hmm.
end. But like you said, it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It's that they're doing different things. And sometimes it's because of how they're trying to translate, whether they're trying to hold more fast to the words or they're trying to get the general meaning across, but also the theological presuppositions of the committee that is translating it. Which is another reason why you want a committee, right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
don't want a Bible that's just all one person's theological bend in the way they translate everything. I want a little bit more balance, but within a committee, they're all going to be in the general camp, right? They're all going to
Yeah.
be evangelicals, or they're all going to be progressive scholars, or they're all going to be mainstream or something like that. They're all going to kind of be from the same camp generally. And so translations are going to have theological bends in the way that they translate things. And that's just something else to the important thing as we're going to talk about as we move through is just knowing your translation. What are they trying to do and where are they coming from so that you read the translation correctly? And don't just assume that, well, this is the only thing that this verse can mean because it says that. Well, that's one way to render what it says. But go read a different translation and you'll find a different way to render the meaning of that. And again, for most translations and most verses, there's not much of a difference.
Mm-hmm.
There are some where there are differences. and we have to kind of sit around and talk about them. And that's things that aren't, there's some things we try to make black and white that have a little bit of gray because there's multiple ways to correctly translate them that lean in different directions. And that's just important for a Bible study as a whole as well.
Yeah. Pausing for just a moment here as we take a break from the conversation, just to catch up. Here's what I'm struggling with, because we're ahead. We've mentioned this. We're ahead on our episodes and stuff. So I don't know where in the timeline we are with what has happened and what hasn't yet happened, mostly within your life. Because I'm just preaching and teaching away. I'm just
Yeah.
doing the work kind of unimpeded as far as that goes. You are all over the map with marriage and moves and honeymoon and school.
Yeah.
School, that's the other one. Yeah, forgot that one.
When this comes out, we should be at the end of August. School has started. I have not yet been gotten married and I have not yet moved. And so this is I think this is going to, if everything stays true, this will be the last episode before all the big changes come.
Okay.
Now, we will probably pre-record some stuff so we have material during that period. But this is the last one that you'll see before the next one that will come out. I should be married, getting ready to move. I don't think I will have moved quite yet when the next episode comes out, but we'll be kind of right in the middle of the marriage moving.
One
There's too much going
gradual
on.
steps as we go. You'll look like you're
Right in the middle of the school semester. So
it'll look like your life is organized on these podcasts with all the
it's
structure and everything, but you'll be
it's not.
actually in chaos in real life. So the internet is not always what it seems. I'm gearing up for just now the end of summer. Thank goodness. All that chaos of ministry being over, now moving into uh the holiday periods of the up and downs of trunk or treat stuff, Thanksgiving stuff, Christmas stuff. But there's breaks in between. So, and I'm heading towards my yearly vacation. It's many months from now, but it's right here. It's right here on
I
my
get
head.
it.
Oh goodness. Okay, I want to make sure that we always talk about not just thinkingtheologically.org, but also our Facebook page, where we are most easily reached. If you're wanting to get a hold of us with any kind of comments on episodes, or maybe even congratulations about the various things happening in Spencer's life, he'd love to get those kinds of comments, criticisms, all those sorts of things there on our Facebook page, Thinking Theologically. On our website, thinkingtheologically.org, we have what episode is this? 91. So we have so many previous episodes, including interviews. That's outside of our 91, I believe. Those are not
Correct.
recorded. So we have 91 of me and Spencer talking to each other, and then we have a bunch of interviews of mostly Spencer talking to other people that aren't me, and one of me talking to somebody that's not Spencer. We have a bunch of those episodes for interviews that are out, additional written things that are there that overlap with things that we've discussed on the podcast, or maybe just are relevant seasonally, or just something we're thinking about in all of this. Also on the website, under our resources, you can find a few different things. You can find our Logos affiliate link, which will let you have 60 free days with the program instead of the normal 30 days if you were just to go there on your own. We've said this every time we've talked about this. Spencer and I both use the program, both helpful. And thinking about translations, it's very easy to see multiple translations of a section right away. It's very easy as well to see the original language. In addition to all of that, to kind of see the philosophy at work and how these translations decided to go, like what route they went down with those things. So definitely check out our Logos link there under resources. As well as we've mentioned this a time or two. Spencer's book, Cultivating Culture, Creating Spirit Powered Churches for the Future. It's a work that he had worked on, a book that he had worked on for a time there, and that's available for you to buy either as a single or multiple for your congregation. And let's see, this is at the time of the recording, this thing is coming up, this speaking session, right? But it will have been
Yes.
long past when this goes up. But he's actually speaking at a congregation on this particular subject. So if that's something that you're interested in, maybe you get the book and think it's a good thing to go through, then you can have Spencer not in September, probably with everything else.
Any other month,
Any
any
other
other month, I
month,
probably can.
any other month,
Uh,
come
yeah,
and speak on it. Go ahead.
yeah, just church culture, I think, is just so important of thinking about what kind of culture we're cultivating in our church and how that impacts the way that we participate in God's story, our
Mhm.
kingdom mission. All of that is kind of determined by the cultures that we create, and that's just the book is an overview of Paul's letters and kind of how I see Paul trying to cultivate culture
Mm.
and how that impacts into our church. And as Jack says, a week after recording, a week ago, once this episode comes out, I was in Houston giving a couple of presentations on culture, just kind of the introductory stages of thinking about this
Yeah.
process. And so, yeah, buy the book. If you want me to do some speaking on it or something like that, I'd be happy to do that as well. And there's contact information and all that on the website. So you can buy the book, you can reach out about speaking things. All of that is on there.
Yeah. Make sure you check out thinkingtheologically.org for all of the things we talked about and probably more. There's probably something that I forgot with all of that. And be sure to reach out to us with any questions that you might have. And with all that, we'll return back to our discussion on Bible translations. Okay, so we said good and bad translations. Maybe the better phrasing is successful and translations that fail. And maybe what I should say is all of these translations are successful in accomplishing their goal. And now those goals are not always the same, but there is some overlap in generally what they're trying to do. So goals of translation. What are translations of the Bible trying to do for the most part?
I want to list 4 goals of translations, and that will kind of help us move into then I'm going to give 4 questions to ask based upon those goals. Like when you're trying to evaluate a translation, what do you ask about it to
Mm.
kind of figure
Mhm.
out, is this a good translation? Is it not? That kind of a thing. The first goal is accuracy. Translations seek to transmit so that the readers receive the same message. And so you want a translation that is accurate to the original message. Now, we talked about how there's multiple different ways to be accurate. Not every verse in the Bible is there only one way in which to translate it. More often there's more of a range of accurate translations, and that kind of goes back into what we talked about what's their approach, functional versus formal, and the theology of the committee is going to kind of help influence that. And so accuracy doesn't mean that there's one way that it's translated, but that it's accurately kind of bringing across that message. Second is appropriateness, that where the style reflecting attitude reflects the attitude and intention of the author. And so there's not just an act terms of accuracy, but also appropriateness, fitting the attitude and the intention of the author. So let me give you an example of this. I actually gave this to Jack before we started because this is on my mind. I'm getting ready to preach about the crucifixion, and in the Gospel of Luke, Luke's version of the crucifixion emphasizes more so than the other gospels that Jesus is innocent. And so the term innocent keeps showing up Pilate tries to release Jesus 3 times in Luke. So we see that the innocence of Jesus. And so when the centurion watches Jesus die, in Mark, he says, surely this was the Son of God, which fits within Mark's discipleship, messianic secret themes. In Luke, the centurion says, surely this man was righteous, which is the way the NIV translates it. The New Revised Standard Version translates it as innocent. So both are accurate, but in terms of the intention of the author and Luke trying to speak of Jesus' innocence, he's likely using the term righteous to speak of Jesus' innocence. And so the NRSV might be better in terms of it might be a bit more of an appropriate word to use because it fits within the author's greater intentions than the NIV. It's not that either one is accurate or inaccurate, but that's just something else. And that's on a minor scale of just thinking about the appropriateness of the way that things are chosen to be translated. Third is they seek naturalness. They want to be translated so that readers can naturally read the text for meaning. You don't want a translation that is hard to understand. And I'm sorry to King James only people, but most English speakers cannot figure out what it's trying to say. And that doesn't make for a great translation. A good translation seeks to be natural so that someone can pick it up and get the meaning, which is why most Bibles are written on like a 5th grade reading level. Because the idea is you want the average person to walk into that Barnes & Noble, pick up a Bible, read it, and be able to understand the meaning of the text that they are reading. Fourth, the goal of translation has to do with the form of the final product. It wants to reflect the text as the original text, but yet still readable for others. And so you want a form that balances the accuracy and the appropriateness with the naturalness. You want to balance there. You want to be able to read and to understand while it also being accurate and appropriate for the original meaning and words and usage of the audience. So with that in mind, 4 important questions to ask when you're evaluating a translation. First, is it accurate? Does it reflect the world of the Bible? And to me, let's think of accuracy in this regard. First, what Greek text does it use? Does it use an updated, eclectic text? Number 1, is it accurate in that regard? The second question for accurate is, was it translated by a committee? Is it just one person's ideas, which might be helpful, as Jack said, more in line of like a commentary or a study Bible helpful? But if we're thinking of the primary version we want to use, we want updated, eclectic Greek text translated by committee. That's how you're going to get the most accurate translation. So first, is it accurate? Second, is it clear? Does it use understandable language? Can you read it and understand what is being said? Second, is it clear? Third, is it natural? And by natural, I mean when we're thinking of clarity, sometimes things can be clear, but we kind of have to think about it. It's not really natural. And I would kind of argue what we're looking for in a translation is not only that it's clear, but that it's natural. Not just can we understand, but is it kind of easy for us to flow through? And then fourth, is it audience appropriate? How well do hearers or readers get the message? And this is where I want to think for a minute about the context in which we use a translation. So in a context of my personal study, a translation that I use may be different than the context of a sermon that I preach. And so I'm going to use myself as an example, and we'll talk about some individual translations here in a moment. But for my personal study, I use the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version. Its philosophy, it fits somewhere in the middle. It leans a little bit more towards the formal equivalent, so trying to stay a little truer to original words and things like that than like an NIV would. And so it can sometimes be a little bit more wooden, a little bit more bumpy, a little bit harder to read and to understand. But when you're doing personal study like me, and I know Greek and I'm in the Greek and I normally have my Greek Bible. I actually have a Greek Bible that's Greek on one side, New Revised Standard on the other. So I'm
Mm.
kind of comparing things. I want something that's a little bit closer to the original, but I also want something that I don't have to think too hard about, right? That is still kind of easy for me to get the general idea across. So that's what I choose. And that's also what I teach class in, because in a class, when you're kind of diving deeper, and sometimes I'll ask, okay, people, you have some different translations. What does your Bible say? What does your Bible say? And we're kind of thinking a little bit deeper into the text. Now, that fits that context well. When I preach, I use the NIV. And here's why. First, the majority of the people in my congregation, when they're following along, have an NIV. And so if they're following along, it's easier for them to follow along if their Bible matches what I'm reading from. And there's not a bunch of differences. So I want that to match. Secondly, most people don't bring a Bible to church anymore. And so all they're doing is hearing it. And so when you're preaching, I think you want a version that's easier to understand when heard. And so the versions like an NRSV, that's a little bit more wooden, a little bit more difficult to read, is going to be easier to read when you can look at it. It's going to be more difficult to understand when you're just hearing it. The more readable a version is, the easier it is to hear without being able to see and to follow along. So when you're preaching, I think generally you want a version that's easier for hearers, not something that is easier when read. And so that's where and that's where I've said, I've thought about changing to like New Living Translation or something like that just for preaching, because even the
Mm.
NIV, there are versions now that are easier when heard. And just the fact that in most churches, people aren't following along. And if they're not following along, you want something that is easy for them to hear. But also, there's just the consideration of what version do people have in their hands? Most people have never heard of the New Revised Standard Version. And so I don't think I would be a good preacher getting up to preach from a version that nobody's ever heard from when the majority of people in my context have an NIV out. Preach from the NIV so that they can follow along. And that's different for different congregations, right? So if I was at Jack's congregation that has the ESV sitting in the pews, I'm not sure I would be that great of a preacher getting up there and preaching from the NIV when everybody's following along in a different version of the Bible. And so your audience is something that's important, particularly for preachers and teachers to understand, is what is the context, what is the audience, and even what am I trying to get out of the text is going to kind of help with. And that's where multiple translations comes in as well. So I generally preach from the NIV, but there's some series that I will actually use a different translation, and sometimes for a particular verse within a sermon I'll move to a different translation because I like the way that it translates it. So that's an example of when I'm preaching on the crucifixion and I'm reading from Luke about the centurion, I'm going to move from the NIV to the NRSV because I like the word innocent better and it fits better with kind of the point that I'm trying to make in the sermon and what the point that I think Luke is trying to make. And then I revert back to the NIV, back to and when I do that, I put it up on the screen so that people can follow along if they want to. Now, we might do something down the road about that's more of preaching technique and what fits better. But
Sure. Yeah.
that's just something that we don't often think about is, especially in ministry, is how widely used is a version. And I
Mhm.
think that's something to, because again, even if you're just someone in the pew, you might not want a version that nobody uses because when you're studying in a Bible class or you're hearing a sermon or something like that, your version's never going to match,
Right.
right? You get
Right.
the NRSV, which is my preferred, but you're probably never going to walk into a church where that's what the guy's preaching from. You're probably never going to sit in a Bible class where that's what the Bible teacher. And so you might want something that is a little bit more accessible and connects with the places that you're going to be, if that makes sense. And so that's something else that I think is often overlooked. We think about accuracy and readability, which are important, but if nobody else uses the translation, then I'm not sure how important those things are, especially in a preaching and a teaching context. You
Yeah.
want something that better connects with your audience
Yeah.
and but still gets the message across, right? You don't connect with your audience at the expense of the
Right.
message, but you kind of have to no translation does all of those things perfectly. So you have to balance accuracy with readability with connection to the audience and what's the most important. And that's my point in preaching. You want something accurate, but you have to be very, very concerned about what's going to connect to the audience because everything you read could be accurate. But if I always say a sermon isn't a sermon unless it's heard. So
Mhm.
you can preach all day, but if nobody hears and understands, then you haven't preached.
Right.
And translations make a big difference in the hearing of what you're saying.
Yeah. So you've already outed me as the ESV user. Yeah, so two thoughts. The first going along with the most recent point of I'm preaching from ESV. It's what I teach from as well, though in class, because of the context, there will often be times of, does somebody have a different word here? And then we like, well, I've got this. Okay, great. That's actually the better word, and we'll have that kind of discussion sometimes in our classes. So it's there I am banking on the fact that other people are using different translations. What One of the things that we've done to mitigate that in a worship setting is our scripture readings. There are two. One of them is communion. One's for my lesson. Um, and then when I'm in my lesson, we have ESVs in the pew, which they changed when I got here because they asked what I use. And then we include the page number of, you'll find it on this page, so that we can kind of do that thing of, if you don't have a Bible, we've got one and it's right here, and do it that way. But the other side of this is, there's one guy I knew who, one of my professors, he would preach sometimes from a Greek text that he translated as he was going and just reading through it. He would just translate it on the fly. He was very good with the Greek language, and so that was something that he could do. But at his home congregation, he would most often, and what they had in the pews was the NIV, for the exact reason that you stated. And if you know much about translations and you're hearing that, you're going Greek text to NIV, the goal of what the NIV is trying to do would be very different than what you're doing if you're trying to strictly translate the Greek translation. But it was the same thing that you said. This is very readable and understandable. So that's what I preach from. Even though he can do this, maybe we could argue, a lot more accurate, a lot more. His interest was in getting the message across. So good things to consider, as far as if we have ministers listening, that's something to consider, is the translation you use is not just affecting you, it also has ramifications for how
Mhm.
your message is heard. But then number two, like, think through, as you're studying, opening up multiples to see how those things come across. Study in groups can be helpful too, when you're going, what's the KJV say, because you know that guy reads that, and you can all share those things together. So with all that, I think we're getting into specific translations now, and what their goals are. I don't know how much of this will say out loud versus just leave within the show notes for people to see. And we're not hitting literally every translation that exists. There are very, very many of them, but these are, I think, going through the list here, I think these are the most widely used still, at this point. And then there's some weird ones here and there, and some up and comers as well. But We'll start with KJV, I suppose, when it comes to
Yeah.
translations. Let's go right with an old classic that is still in use today.
Well, yeah, this will probably be a bit of like a speed round of all of this is in the show notes, as you said, and just kind of going through this and hitting on a few things, but just giving you some of the background to go through some of these
Mhm.
questions. And so the first, the King James version, we could think of original 1611 King James, which is I'm sorry, a terrible translation. And you'll see as I kind of go
I
through
don't
this.
think there are any KJV onlys that are listening to our podcast
We
anyway.
we
So
probably chased them all away, but if you ever want to debate with one, here's some
there
information
we
to
go.
use. The KJV is a revision of the Bishop's Bible. It's based on Erasmus's Textus Receptus, which was one of the first Greek texts of the entire New Testament
Mhm.
that was put together. But here's something interesting: Erasmus Textus Receptus had one manuscript in Revelation,
Mm.
one for the Gospels in general, one manuscript of the epistles, and they all dated late. I want to say like a 10th, 11th century was the early one. And if you go back to our previous episodes, we talked about the thousands of manuscripts that we have that date all the way back to the second century. None of them had been discovered yet. And he used, like three or four manuscripts total, and the one in Revelation wasn't complete. So part of Revelation was translated from the Latin Vulgate back
Mm.
into Greek and then Greek into English which just means it was a remarkable feat for the time.
Oh yeah, yeah,
But
absolutely.
in today's standards, it is very, very inaccurate because of all of the manuscripts that we've discovered since then, all of the knowledge that we've developed about the first century world since then. It's just, it's very inaccurate. Here's a quote about it. The KJV scholars could have known fewer than 25 late manuscripts of the New Testament, and these were carelessly used. Today, there are over 5,000 known New Testament manuscripts and fragments. So, just they didn't have the manuscripts to be able to put together an accurate Greek text to then be able to translate into English, though they did the best with what they had. So, there have been better manuscripts that have been found. Two other things to consider. The original King James included the Apocrypha, which a lot of KJV only people don't realize we want
Yep.
to reject the Apocrypha as scripture, and I think as Protestants, and I think we're good to do that. I think it's helpful to have, which is one of the
Mhm.
reasons I use the new Revised Standard Version. It's one of the few versions that has a scholarly translation of the Apocrypha that can be included in it
Mm.
as well. But it originally included the Apocrypha, and so if you truly believe that the King James Version is a version that fell from the sky, then you believe that the Apocrypha is inspired as well, which most KJV only people do not. And the English language has changed both in spelling and in meaning, and that goes back to the point of one of the primary things. The primary purpose of a translation is to get the meaning across to the people who are reading it or hearing it. The original KJV cannot do that because it is using an outdated form of English.
Yeah.
So, next, to think about the New King James Version, it is a revision and an update of the language of the original King James Bible. It's not really an updated of the Greek that's translating it, it's just updating the English. So, all of the problems with Greek manuscripts and accuracy for the King James flows over to the New King James Version. It uses a majority text type, which we've talked about is problematic. The language in the KJV, in the New King James, I would say is becoming outdated, or if not completely outdated now. And it's in some circles it's popular, but in most it's not a very popular translation. And so that becomes the other problem of even if you are, I like the New King James Version, for most people, it's not a version that's going to connect. It's used as outdated English. It is a version that most people don't use.
To the point we were making about ministry earlier, by the way, I did attend a King James, New King James only congregation, and I didn't know that until I got there because I was on vacation. And so I set my ESV down in the pew and used one of their pew Bibles, which was King James or New King James. So it was a reversal on what we've been saying before. But if that's what they're using, that's what I'll be using today, for the purposes of connecting with what's being said as much as I can. But yeah, you're seeing less and less of it now, like that.
And if you think of it from a preaching standpoint, I mean, I'm just going to be honest. A sermon where you're saying "thouest doth do,"
Right.
that does not connect with
It's
hearers. And if the
distracting.
point is to get a
Yeah.
message heard, it's not the way to do it.
Right.
It's just not. Okay.
Agreed.
Continuing the ESV. I'll let Jack talk about this here in a moment because it's his
It's my
version
translation.
of choice. It
Yeah.
was my version of choice at one point in time.
Yeah.
I have changed since then, as I mentioned. The ESV, the English Standard Version, is a revision of the Revised Standard Version. So that's where you get the Standard Version in there. It uses a modern eclectic Greek text base. It was updated. I don't remember the last update. What wasn't too long ago? I don't
Yeah, no,
think.
there's a recent one.
3 years
Yeah,
ago,
something like
something
that.
like that. There was an update, and so it's been updated relatively recently. It uses a good Greek base. It's translated by a committee. The ESV is translated by an evangelical committee. So something to just know about the ESV is on some of those debatable passage, it's going to lean evangelical and conservative in the way that they translate it, as opposed to some other translations. That's just the theological bend of the committee. It tends to be a more literal translation with some alterations for readability. So it is somewhere in the middle, but it leans on the side of formal equivalence, trying to stay a little bit closer to the original text, which can make some things in the ESV
Mhm.
a little bit hard to read, hard to understand. And to me, one of the test cases for it is you have Joe Blow from your church get up and read scripture. How much does he stumble through it? Is one way that you could kind of test the readability
Yeah.
of a version. And there's some things in the ESV that are easy to read. There are some things that are a little bit more difficult to read, just at least from my experience. But it is a very popular version, particularly among evangelical and conservative church communities. And so that's kind of, again, if you're like knowing your audience and you're going to a heavily evangelical church to preach, you probably want to pull out the ESV. At least that's what I would do. That's what they're going to be comfortable with. That's what they're going to be reading from. That's what they're not going to push back against. And as we talked about, it's a perfectly fine translation. It does kind of bend towards a conservative way of doing it because that's what the committee is. That's why those communities tend to favor it. I will say my biggest pushback against the ESV is the lack of gender inclusive language, the use of brother instead of brother and
Yeah,
sister.
yeah, yeah.
Is kind of that's why I changed just from a preaching perspective, is wanting to be more inclusive in the language that is being used. But what's interesting is the new revised standard version. Now it's been updated, and the copy that I have is not the most, but it and I don't know when they switched. I haven't done this, but the newest version is not gender inclusive in every case of like man. So mankind instead of humankind, which is one of my complaints about the new revised. It gets the brothers and sisters right and stuff like that,
Mhm.
but I like the humankind inclusivity instead of the mankind inclusivity. So like when I put it up on the screen, I actually change it.
Oh, okay.
And when
Yeah.
I read it differently. So if you ever followed along, I change mankind to humankind because I don't like that. So you could use the ESV and do what I do and add ancestors.
You're adding to scripture is crazy. What
Yeah,
an
I know.
admission.
I know.
Uh, no, that's actually the comment I was going to make. So I went from NIV. I have it still, the one I had 2005 when I got baptized. Like I was using NIV middle school, high school, towards the end of high school, and then going into college. It was ESV, and somewhere in there I had like a year of the New American Standard, and I wanted something that was a good, trying to be word for word, but New American Standard, which we'll talk about in a minute, was was not as readable as this ESV that was coming out, and it was fairly recent. The Bible I have is like the 2007 ESV, so that's what it is, and it's um, I've used that forever, and haven't found a ton of reason to change yet from a readability standpoint. However, and I don't always do it because I'm not always thinking about it, but I have. You could go back and look at some of my sermons to prove this. There are a lot of times where I'm reading and I will say brothers and sisters. It almost always has the footnote, but it doesn't. It'll have brothers, and then here's the footnote that says also brothers and sisters, and it'll have Adelphoi down there to show like it could be that, but we went brothers. Yeah, that's one of those things for sure, and I'll be interested to see because we have had guys stand up and read from it, and I went, yeah, okay, there's a couple of the words are starting to get weird now from a public standpoint of reading, but I'm still in there in my little evangelical conservative community copy paste Bible with the ESV. But that's how I got there. That's where I'm hanging out right now. But okay, New American Standard picking up, which is one I moved from into ESV. They're relatively similar, but where do they differ here? We'll see maybe here in a moment.
Yeah, the New American Standard Bible is a revision of the American Standard Version, which makes sense why it's called New American Standard. It uses a modern eclectic text base, as does the ESV. I don't know the last time it was updated because I don't use it, but it's translated by a translation committee. I believe their committee leans conservative as well. It was the New
Yeah.
American Standard was kind of the ESV before the ESV became a thing. Might be a way to think about it. So the New American Standard seeks to be literal but readable. This is what the preface says, and this is a quote: to adhere as closely as possible to the original languages of the Holy Scriptures and to make the translation in a fluent and readable style according to current English usage. So it's kind of doing the same thing as the ESV. So you can kind of think it about, it's in this middle portion somewhere, but on the side towards
Hmm.
the more formal
Yeah.
equivalent. And that's what it's trying to do. One of the problems is it's not widely used any longer. Most people don't use it anymore. Like I said, I don't. Did you happen to look up when the
Uh,
last time it was
so 20
updated?
2020, I guess they had an update. That was their
2020.
last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I know for a while it was kind of getting outdated in the language.
95 was the one before that
Um,
when it was,
so they
yeah,
went
it's a long time.
25
Yeah,
years
long time.
between, because I know for a long time it was getting very outdated. So I'm glad they did update it. So it might be a little bit better now, at least an updated
But the ESV
version.
did supplant it, I think, as the because that was even happening in school where a lot of the teachers were using New American, but some were swapping over to ESV, and so we'd have some back and forth sometime in class. But that's the one that took over the other for the conservative circles.
Honestly, if the New American Standard had updated earlier, that might not have happened because I know
Yeah,
the readability was one of the reasons that pulled
yeah.
people to the ESV. Of it was doing the same thing as the New American Standard, and even the same thing as the King James, New King James. It was just updated Greek manuscripts, updated readability, made it a very very popular.
I will say the thing that I appreciated about New American Standard that ESV, there might be some that do this, but all the ones I've had have never done this. New American Standard would do a good job of italicizing things that were like, this is a supplied English word. There's not really a Greek word for it. We're just trying to make it, ironically, more readable. But so as a student, you could look at that and go, oh, this word's not here, but they think that that's what's being conveyed. So from a student standpoint, I liked it, but the readability is why I switched. So
Next, we will talk about the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which is a revision of the Revised Standard Version, which is the same thing that the ESV is a revision from. So they The ESV and the NRSV come from the same line of translations.
Mhm.
They just where they tend to differ is with the committee. So they both use the modern eclectic Greek text base. The NRSV was updated, I want to say last year, 24. It might have been 23. It's been updated within in the last couple of years because the one that I have now is out of date. It might have been as early as 22, but in the last 3 years, the NRSV has been updated. The translation committee, whereas the ESV committee is conservative evangelical, the NRSV committee is more scholarly and so a little bit more liberal or progressive, not in a crazy way. Like if you read the two, you wouldn't see a ton of differences. But in some of those debatable passages, the NRSV leans a little bit more towards a progressive way of interpreting it because it's more of a scholarly committee, which is why the NRSV is the scholarly standard. So if you read a scholarly something in a journal or a more critical scholarly commentary, and they're not translating it themselves, they're quoting from the New Revised Standard
Mhm.
version. So that's kind of the scholars. Every scholar that I know, when they recommend a version, recommends the New Revised Standard version. And so that's why it became my chosen version for most of what I do, because on the school scholarly side of things, if I use an English version, that's the version that I typically need to use from.
Sure.
And I tend to agree. So theologically, I agree with some of the way that they translate things over the way the ESV translates things. I like the gender inclusive language that it has, with the exception of mankind instead of humankind. Not a big fan that they did that, at least in the update that they had a couple of years ago. Not a big fan of that, but I tend to agree with that. So it's this is the way that the preface defines what they're trying to do. It desires a literal but readable translation as well. It says as literal as possible, as free as necessary. So it's kind of along the same lines of the ESV, the New American Standard. It's probably a little more closer to the middle than those two are, a little bit more on the readable side. Its biggest drawback is it's not really used outside of scholarly circles. There's not, even if you go on like Amazon, there's not a ton of options if you were going to buy one. The other thing, the other positive with it is if you want a Bible with the Apocrypha, the NRSV is the one to
Mhm.
get. So I have a copy with and without the Apocrypha.
Yeah.
Did you look up
Uh,
when it was
I
updated?
did, but there was a bunch of conflicting stuff. So I saw something as like, well, 21, but then there was, I guess, April of this year, apparently, some kind of. So I couldn't find a solid date for that.
Okay, next, and this is the final one I'll mention, the NIV, the 2011, and I think it's been updated since 2011. Jack, you can look that up. But
Yeah.
a lot of people that don't like the NIV for some ways that it translates some things typically bring up problems with the pre 2011. So when they updated it in 2011, and there were some pretty good scholars that were a part of the NIV committee,
Looks like
uh, it f-
2011. Yeah.
it fixed a lot of the issues that people before had a problem with. So, like the ones we've been talking about, modern eclectic Greek text space, it's translated by a committee. Of all of these, it's the most readable translation. It actually sits probably somewhere in the middle. It's not way far to the readable side, where like the message, which is a paraphrase, would reside. It probably sits right in the middle between readability and kind of that word for word desire. It does use gender inclusive language. I like the language that it uses for gender inclusive the most out of all of my Bibles. No, I'm wrong. The NIV is the one that uses mankind sometimes, which I don't like, not the
Mhm.
NRSV. So you can kind of scratch what I've said. That's the one place where it doesn't fully go as far as I would like to in thinking of the gender. It's probably the most popular version out there,
Yeah.
followed second by the ESV. The ESV just kind of has its lane where it's the most
Mhm.
popular.
Yeah.
as a whole, I think the NIV is the most popular, and so that's just something to consider, which is why it's the version that generally I preach from. But I guess the thing that I want to conclude with is use multiple translations.
Yep.
And if you kind of haven't gotten that point of different things that they're trying to do, different levels of readability, different theological persuasions of the committee, all of that goes into this process of translation is interpretation. And so you want to see kind of the different ways that you can accurately translate something. And then just know what the translation is, right? So if you're reading an ESV, know that it's going to be an evangelical interpretation, right? If you're reading the NRSV, know that it's going to be a more scholarly, progressive translation. If you read the Message, that's a paraphrase, know that it's trying to just, in very, very general terms, get across what's there. And there are even some Bibles that take word to an extreme, which you might want to use in some
Mhm.
situations, but just know that's what they're trying to do. It's not going to be very readable. They don't care at all about getting the meaning across. They're trying to get the words across, which means that you might misunderstand some things because they're not all that focused about the meaning. And then, if you have something like the NIV that sits almost perfectly, I think, in the middle of those two kind of extremes. So use multiple translations and just know what they're trying to do. And the way you know that is to read your preface. I mean, you could search it on ChatGPT, I guess, and they'll probably tell you. But I mean, spend 5 minutes and read the preface of your Bible.
There are tons of other translations that exist out there, trying to do very different things. Some of them, I would say, they're all successful at what they're trying to do. That doesn't mean that they're all all worth your time. Necessarily, don't go buy a Gen Z Bible. That exists. Don't buy it. It's ridiculous. Uh, modern slang as much as possible. However, it is a good showing of what it looks like to take the modern like vernacular and use it as a translation model. Bible won't last very long, but good one to use.
Yeah, I'll say that about like a Gen Z Bible is again, knowing where it's from, it's probably not a Bible that you want to preach from because it's
Correct.
much more on the readable side
Hmm.
than it is the accuracy side. But if you were going to preach at or teach something at church camp and you wanted to like brainstorm some ways to get the idea across, I probably wouldn't read from it, but incorporating that into your study of just thinking about, hey, what are some ways to kind of make this idea connect?
Yeah, yeah,
You know, because there's the other thing that people are concerned about when it comes to the respect of the Bible, and I think
it's
there's
fair.
something to be said
Yeah,
there, but I don't think using modern slang is necessarily disrespectful because you want it to be heard. But I'm not sure I'm comfortable with the Bible that uses the word like Riz or something like that.
yeah,
But that may set up an illustration, right? Where
mhm,
maybe you do
yeah, might,
use that
yeah,
term maybe you use Riz to illustrate something and you get that idea from reading that. And it's like, hey, I've got this story that might help me illustrate this point in a way that they will understand. Or maybe you even go online and you search for a video and maybe you find, a TikTok video or something like that that will kind of engage that kind of audience. But again, that's all in the context of knowing what it's trying to do,
yep.
what it's not trying to do, who it's for, who it's not for. All of that, plays a role in there. And that's why, it's the same point of, if I want to know what NT Wright thinks about something, I might go read his
Mhm.
translation. And that's kind of the same thing of wondering of, well, how might a Gen Z person kind of think about this concept?
I might use the Message for the Psalms. That was one thing that I had heard a lot because it's written in such a way that the poetic really just a very modern poetry reading of the Psalms. Like, oh, okay, this really speaks to me. I did not have Riz on the podcast bingo card. Didn't think we were going to do
There
that,
you
but
go.
this
I still remember the Wednesday night when our youth had to teach me what that word meant. Um, so
Maybe
There
that
you go.
speaks to my translation preference where I know what those words mean, but I am too old. I refuse to use them. And so so ESV is where I'm at. Maybe that's what that means.
I've never used the word in a sermon, by the way,
Okay.
but,
Good. Not yet. Not yet.
yeah, not yet.
Let us know what translation you use, what ones you like. I know that there are some that have not been mentioned, so I'll give a special shout out to the Legacy Standard Bible, which I know a lot of people. That one feels like it's starting to pick up some users from people that I talk to, just generally within the church that are maybe more serious students. Is not the phrase I want to use. It's the best one I can find. So shout out to that. If you're using that one, let us know. But let us know what you use, which ones you prefer, where you use the different ones, if you use multiple and all of this. And be sure to come back for our next episode where we talk about who knows. We're not entirely sure what we're going to deal with yet. I think we'll move into kind of a different thing. But whatever we discuss, use of multiple translations is going to apply. These various episodes and thoughts we've had on textual criticism and all of those things continue to apply. So make sure you listen to those, stay on top of those as we move forward with some different topics. Let us know what you'd like to hear, what you think about those particular episodes. That does it for this one. I'm Jack. That's Spencer. We'll see you next time.